The Trump administration is radically reshaping America and the world around it. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr. Emma Shortis examines Trump's grim vision for America and the future of the Australia-US alliance. Pre-order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order, or become a Foundation subscriber to Vantage Point at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
The argument at that time was you could end up with $100,000 degrees, and it was a very powerful argument. It sank what was then the Abbott government's chief higher education policy. Fast forward 10 years, some people are halfway there.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast which explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. Today we're talking about higher education, from HECS cuts to vice-chancellor pay and Julie Bishop's travel budget. It's a hot topic. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute. The re-elected Albanese government says its first order of business in the new parliament will be to reduce the debt burden on Australian graduates.
We will be a government for every Australian who wants to train or retrain for new skills and a good job. Every Australian who works hard for the life-changing opportunity of higher education.
What is the first item on the agenda for you?
20% cut in student debt, as I promised.
That'll be welcome relief for students who've copped soaring fees at the same time as rising rents and food prices. But expensive degrees are far from the only issue. Wage theft, job cuts, and serious concerns about governance and accountability are plaguing the sector. Great countries have great institutions, but Australia's universities are in crisis. So what can a second-term Albanese government do to address it? Joining me today is Dr. Joshua Black, postdoctoral fellow here at the Institute. G'day, Josh.
G'day, Glenn.
And with him is our senior economist, Jack Thrower. G'day, Jack.
G'day, Glenn.
So let's start with you, Josh. Many people listening right now will have gone to university when the cost was never a factor. Some maybe even when it was free. How expensive is going to university in 2025?
Well, it depends who you ask, but I think to begin answering that question, I'd rewind about a decade or so when we were having huge debates in Australia about deregulating higher education completely. And the argument at that time was you could end up with $100,000 degrees. And it was a very powerful argument. It sank what was then the Abbott government's chief higher education policy. Fast forward 10 years, some people are halfway there. We do see people graduating humanities, arts, communications degrees with a $50,000 HECS debt. And that's thanks to price and policy changes implemented by the Morrison government in 2020 under the aptly named Job Ready Graduates package, which sought to incentivise students to enrol in some degrees that would be cheaper for students to enrol in and which the Commonwealth would subsidise to a greater extent. And whose costs have risen largely in line with inflation over time. And this was compared with those other degrees I've mentioned, humanities, arts, communications, whose costs now quickly amount to about $50,000 across the life of a degree. So significant costs.
And let's talk more broadly about costs for students. Jack, we're talking about fees, but also we're in a cost of living crisis. Housing and other essentials are more expensive than ever. Are students being shafted across the board here?
They definitely are. So one of the main ways that students used to be able to support themselves during study was government assistance. So generally the government will give you money if you're not currently working. So if you're a carer, if you're unemployed, and they provide it to students to help them during their studies. But what we've seen over time is the number of people receiving the payments that go to students, so AusStudy and Youth Allowance, has declined, while we see the number of students continue to rise. And this is due to a number of reasons. It's essentially just got very hard to get these payments. So if your parents earn too much, regardless of whether they actually support you, then you might be ineligible. There's all sorts of work requirements to prove that you're independent of your parents. And even if you get these payments, then they're well below the poverty line. We talk a lot about how job seeker is not high enough and it leaves a lot of people in poverty, and that's definitely true, but these payments are even lower than job seeker. One analysis from Anglicare, they looked at tens of thousands of rentals and none of them would be affordable to someone on youth allowance. So in the midst of a housing crisis, people studying just cannot rely on these sorts of payments and are forced into poverty or to try to juggle work and study and all those sorts of things.
Whose university? Our university. Whose university? Our university.
It's not quite exam season, but ANU has revealed it's facing a serious test.
Dozens of courses are on the chopping block as the University of Canberra undergoes a restructure.
Culling jobs to cut costs. A money-saving measure made by Griffith University.
The University of Tasmania will now carry out 4 weeks of consultation with staff about the proposed changes. But the National Tertiary Education Union isn't convinced that process will be genuine.
It means staff and students are left with many questions, including whether the uni's top salaries will be trimmed.
So that's the burden on students. What about the way universities are spending money? You've both done some research in this area. Maybe we could start on the spending on consultants and travel and marketing.
Yeah, I mean, these are huge expenses across the sector and different universities have different rules for reporting them. So it's interesting, we get these really partial snapshots of what universities in different states spend, but a large university with $1 billion turnover can spend up to, $50 or $60 million on consultancy spending each year. And it doesn't always tell us in very clear detail where that consultancy spending goes, who's benefiting, what the products or services are, what the contracts actually enabled the university to do that it couldn't have done without those consultants. So huge problems around the volume of the spending and with the transparency of the spending as well.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Obviously, transparency would answer some of these questions, but in a very general sense, is it too much?
I think so, because it assumes that universities don't have expertise at their disposal to make strategic decisions about their own future. I mean, staff and students, yes, of course, they have a particular interest in the future of their institution. That's all the more reason to have them helping to make decisions about where their institution is going, what kinds of priorities it sets for itself, and how it best serves the community in which it's located. The use of consultants, 1, generates secrecy inside an organisation, and 2, it locks the people who are most interested in the outcomes of those decisions out of the decision-making process. It kind of puts a lot of expertise to the side and allows it to go to waste. And that causes immense frustration on the part of staff and students, particularly staff.
Yeah, so the optics are bad. What does it do in terms of confidence in the particular university or the sector as a whole?
Nothing good, I think, is the short answer. It does nothing good for either the public's confidence. I mean, the public seeing headlines about how much universities spend on consultants. It clearly feeds into all of the worst perceptions that people in the community do have about universities, which is that they're ivory towers, palaces of luxury where people don't do real work, which is, of course, not true. But it exacerbates all of the worst impressions that people have of universities. And it breeds enormous bad will between the staff who do the research and who do the teaching and the managerial staff who are supposed to be governing them. It creates a lot of bad will.
The university vice-chancellors are usually professors in their own right. They've done their time, they've paid their dues.
Yeah, but Steve, are they delivering 6 times the value of a senior professor at a university to their institution? As you referred to, these are public institutions delivering public education on money that comes from the taxpayer.
Let's stay on optics and turn our attention to Vice-Chancellor salaries, something you've done a bit of work on, Jack. Can any Vice-Chancellor in Australia at the moment justify $1.5 million a year?
I don't think so. So essentially, at the same time as we've seen these governance crises and sort of the real outcomes that we're after in the sector, which is, great research output and educated students, experience all sorts of scandals and declines and things like that. We're also seeing this explosion of vice-chancellor pay. So back in 1985, before the system was deregulated and we're building the quasi-corporate system we have at the moment, then vice-chancellors at our key research universities were on about $300,000 a year if you account for inflation, which is, quite a lot of money. I wouldn't sniff at that. And these days, that's more than quadrupled to about $1.3 million a year. A lot of people are saying things like, because I've done a lot of interviews about this, they'll say, if you need to pay the most to get the best. And from the outcomes that we're seeing at the moment, it doesn't appear that logic holds in this sector. So that's why we've written various reports which are calling for move away from this sort of corporate CEO model and return to more collegiate models of governance. So relying on the students and the staff who actually have the most interest in the success of these institutions, the most knowledge of how these institutions work, relying on them to sort of push forward the governance of these institutions.
So did they go down this corporate model in the first place to make money? And if so, did it work? And then how do you pull it back from that model?
Oh, well, there's sort of a lot of moving parts here. There was lots of justifications for changing the model, but part of it definitely was this business idea of the university, that it is a product that we're selling. During the Howard government, there were a lot of changes to the governing acts of these universities, so essentially their underlying purpose, and they emphasise those sorts of commercial things. So for a variety of reasons, we've seen these universities turn into these sorts of, and I say quasi-corporate very definitively, because while the pay of these vice-chancellors is often compared to CEOs and justified compared to them, they do not face the same level of responsibility or scrutiny or accountability as corporate CEOs would. So they don't face a governance board with strong legal penalties if they don't abide by their duties. So, for instance, company directors can go to jail if they breach their duties. They don't face hostile takeover from other corporations. They don't face strong regulations from corporate regulators. And at the same time, they don't face the same sort of public scrutiny that we see in the public sector. So they rarely face estimates. They rarely face these sorts of public inquiries. And so there's just such this mismatch between the remuneration they're receiving and the level of accountability that's been able to go on in the sector.
And just one last question on VC salaries. And you mentioned the estimates. And speaking of the Senate, you and we put together a submission for a Senate inquiry into this. And one of the recommendations was a cap. What are you suggesting there in terms of capping VC salaries?
The one you're talking about is that Senator Lambie has put forward a cap for Vice-Chancellor pay, which would cap Vice-Chancellor pay at Australian public universities at about $430,000. And I believe that that's informed by comparing it to how much the Treasurer gets paid. So we were essentially supporting the $430,000 cap as presented by Senator Lambie, but there's all sorts of different ways that you could cap these things. You could make it that they can only be paid twice as much as the highest paid academic or something like that. But essentially, our main point in that paper is that it's not the only thing that we need to change in the sector, but making these public institutions publicly accountable for their remuneration decisions would be a good place to start to bring some accountability back into the sector.
It is also important to do things like regulating and more closely monitoring the other roles and functions that a vice-chancellor undertakes outside of their university duties. We've seen in the recent past more than one vice-chancellor taking on, I suppose, a second gig or a side hustle, and clamping down on this kind of stuff is really important. If you're going to be remunerated at that incredibly high level, your sole purpose really does need to be on the job in front of you, which is to govern a large public institution.
And on that note, I don't think that the Treasurer has a side hustle at the moment. I think that he's exclusively focused on looking after the Australian economy.
Okay, look, we're sitting in Canberra, and whether we like it or not, the Australian National University has been a case study for a lot of these scandals. I used the example of Julie Bishop as a bit of a throwaway line in my intro. What is going on in a very broad sense at ANU?
A number of things are going on. I mean, there is a crisis of governance, and it's founded, I think, on what was a perceived crisis, or to some extent an imaginary crisis of finances. So the process began with the announcement last October that the ANU needed to save $250 million from its annual expenditure, and at least $100 million of that total was going to be saved by cutting salaries, that is, job cuts, reducing leave entitlements and so on, so that you basically end up with $100 million of savings on your annual expenditure. And from there, the trouble started. I mean, people started digging into the finances and asking much more critical and robust questions about where all the money had been going, who had been spending it, and how much it actually cost to provide certain degrees and to keep certain people on staff and this kind of thing. And from there, you get much larger questions about governance and misgovernance. You get questions about who knew what about the current vice-chancellor's second job. She was sort of found to have continued working for Intel Corporation while serving concurrently as vice-chancellor. You get questions about potential conflicts of interest and the disclosure thereof, and who knows what about receiving those conflicts of interest. The kinds of questions going to the university's governing council, whether council knew about either the vice-chancellor's external employment or the procurement of consultants to provide advice on financial restructuring. I mean, the level of detail here kind of gives you a sense of just how interrelated and roiling this crisis is at the ANU.
So how dire are the ANU's finances? In fact, how dire are all the universities that are crying poor now, really?
Well, it depends from one state and one institution to the next. But the first point to make is that all of these institutions have much larger net assets than the commentary they run in the media would suggest. So even when a university is telling you that they need to save $100, $200, $250 million, they are sitting on net assets that are valued, according to their own financial reports, upwards of 1 or 2, in the ANU's case, more than $3 billion. So there is an element of perspective that needs to be kept in mind here.
But so what, should they be selling off some of their land?
Well, I mean, some universities have tried this and have ended up in other financial troubles. The University of Tasmania is a useful example to have in mind here. But generally speaking, I mean, if your paper assets are more valuable to you than your human assets, I think that's a problem. And that is where some universities are finding themselves now. In the case of the ANU, the financial crisis was never quite as large as it was made to seem. So recent media stories suggest that the ANU's projected deficit for the year 2024 was overblown by about $60 million. Now, that's not play money. That's an enormous amount of money.
Jack, you're the economist in the room. What is the role of the money that does come in, or a bigger amount that used to come in, from international students in the overall economic stability of our higher education sector?
So international students have essentially become an increasingly important source of revenue for Australian universities. We have seen an increasing percentage of revenue from these students. At the same time, as provided by one of our submissions, the amount of federal funding on higher education has been falling in real terms per student. So the amount of money per student that the government has been giving to these providers has fallen. So in many ways, the sector has been encouraged to rely on these international students. That's not to say that there aren't also governance questions about how much you should responsibly rely on this source of revenue and at the exclusion of others. But it's definitely been an increasing amount of revenue for these universities.
They're a very important cohort for Australian growth and productivity, aren't they?
Well, they're a part of it, but we need to house them.
So when the Real Estate Institute quotes those
sure.
figures, are they wrong that only 4% of international students are in the private rental market?
Well, I just say to you, why do we have a housing crisis in this country? Do we want international students? Fantastic, that's great, and they can contribute to the economy, but we need to have the planning in place before you bring people in, because otherwise they displace Australians from housing, which is exactly what's happened.
Just on the subject of foreign students, until not that long ago, I was a journalist at Parliament House, and they were increasingly, international students turned into a bit of a political plaything, blamed for much of the cost of living crisis and the rental crisis. Is that unfair?
It's totally unfair, Glenn. Firstly, well, the main thing that they're being blamed for is the rental crisis. Most of the evidence shows that, if there is any impact, then it's negligible. The other fact of the matter is that international students just have a pretty rough time in Australia in many ways. Often they're on low incomes. They can't receive government support, even though they're paying these really high fees, which is underwriting many of our universities. Revenue from international students is a major, or has been particularly in the past, a major source of revenue for these universities. So they're paying these high fees. They're often living in not great accommodation. I've lived at university accommodation, and it's not always the best. And yeah, they essentially, there's restrictions on their ability to work. They don't receive government payments. And at the same time, they're being blamed for these crises that entirely aren't their responsibility.
I spent several years living in Singapore, where a lot of parents took a great deal of pride in sending their children to university in Australia. But, let's keep that going with you, Josh. How do you see that in terms of, one, the demonisation of these students, and two, their actual lived experience in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, they've been a really important presence on university campuses, not just in the last 10 or 20 years when they've played this huge financial role in bolstering university finances, but they've been central to Australia's strategic approach to the region in which it lives since at least the 1950s. I mean, the original Colombo Plan was about Australian universities playing a role in bolstering, I suppose, what was then perceived to be the anti-communist effort in the Asia-Pacific region. So international students have long mattered on university campuses, and they've long been, I think, neglected or increasingly actually neglected. I mean, there was quite a bit of support for them in the 1960s and the 1970s. By the 2000s, you see international students often treated as, I suppose, second-class students, and that's a serious problem. In terms of the sort of whole higher education debate and the way that we use international students here, I think it would be great if our political leaders could kind of stop the tape and rewind a little bit. A couple of years ago, we sort of had really big sweeping inquiries into what the future of higher education looks like in Australia, and international students were a small part of a much larger puzzle. What we've seen over the last 18 to 24 months is a political class obsessed with international students, as you say, as a sort of political football, and a very convenient political football at election time because they're not punching back with their vote. So I think that's been, from a moral point of view, particularly disturbing. Many domestic students know that the services they get at university depend on the income that international students are providing. Western Sydney University, I think, is a really good recent example of this. The vice-chancellor, George Williams, has made the point a number of times that if you rip away international students from Western Sydney, not only are there serious cultural effects, you also lose the money that you use to pay for income support, meal support, extra tuition, all sorts of services that university provides, that very particular community in Western Sydney. And I mean, sure enough, this is what has come to pass. WSU has announced that it has to part with, I think, 400 full-time equivalent positions in the near future, and all sorts of services on those campuses will decline as a result. So I think that's a perfect example of just how short-sighted it is to sort of treat international students as this political plaything.
Before we bring the conversation back to the quality of the educational offerings and how that's been impacted by a lot of what we've talked about today, what about keeping this theme going of student satisfaction? What are we hearing with all of this stuff swirling around about financial crises and international students? What are we hearing from students, both from Australia and abroad, about the quality of what's being offered and the experience that they're having at Australian university campuses?
The data kind of indicates that private universities have maintained higher satisfaction rates over time, and that's because they're often much smaller institutions. The financial relationships between student and staff are much more, I suppose, direct, and you get students and staff who know one another's names, who become quite familiar with one another over time. Public universities are such large institutions, and class sizes have expanded over time. I'm not sure about contact hours. I'd need to see the latest data on that, but the personal quality of higher education, which used to be central to the way universities worked, that certainly has declined. Whether student satisfaction as a whole has declined is much harder to tell, but certainly Australia's universities are slipping down the global rankings tables, and I think that is one indicator of just how badly we're squandering a really important moment in the history of higher education.
Is that related to the quality of what's on offer? How much has the number and quality of degrees that are on offer here in Australia now been impacted by the financial stuff that we've been talking about?
I think it's partly because the incentives are to get students through. So the incentives for university managers are to reduce attrition rates and keep those as low as possible, to get students through degrees, to receive the income from those degrees. regardless of the quality. And I think we've seen a slight tapering off in international students even before the sort of recent debates about caps. And that's partly to do with international students looking at the world, looking at Australia's place in the world and asking themselves whether this is necessarily the be-all and end-all to come and get an Australian degree. Similarly with domestic students, I mean, we've seen, despite millions and millions of dollars being spent by each university on advertising each year, we do see a slight plateauing in domestic student enrolments over the last couple of years, or at least a much more modest kind of growth. And that tells us that it's not sensible to be spending millions of dollars competing for what is a shrinking or very slowly growing body of domestic students.
Okay, let's look for a positive out of all of this. Our research calls for a refocus on education and public research rather than commercial performance. The Prime Minister has talked about reducing HECS debts, but what can he and the Education Minister, Jason Clare, do now about some of these bigger problems?
One of the key things that we're recommending is bringing good governance back to the sector. So all sorts of transparency measures, making sure that university councils are populated by staff and students that actually have an investment in the institution as opposed to being mostly appointed, which is what we're seeing at the moment. That we've also called for, in addition to the general governance and accountability amongst people that are in those governance positions, there is also a lack of responsibility between state and Commonwealth government. So currently, technically, the states are meant to regulate these institutions. I think a lot of people wouldn't know that because you don't really see the state governments commenting on universities. You only see the Commonwealth. But the Commonwealth provides the funding and the states are meant to regulate, but neither of them seem to be taking full responsibility for the sector. So in a report by Professor John Quiggin, which was put out by the Australian Institute, we're essentially calling for a full national system of universities. So to properly make sure that the Commonwealth takes responsibility for this sector that is so important to the country, regulating it as well as funding it, and making sure that we excel in research and that everyone has a right to an education. So in addition to those sorts of things, reducing the cost of education, so reducing the cost of those degrees, because as much as we support the 20% reduction in HECS, we don't change the cost of degrees. Those debts are only going to skyrocket again. The government's done some good things in making repaying HECS less burdensome for those repaying. And another thing that they can do would be to making student assistance more available to students in general and as well as students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So we've seen a particular decline in certain student categories, such as first in the family and low socioeconomic students. So fixing those payments, making them above the poverty line and making them easier to get so that people can actually study while they study and they aren't forced to juggle work and study would be one way of getting towards that outcome.
So some great suggestions there. Josh, how much are we at a turning point here? If all of those wonderful suggestions were implemented, how quickly could we turn things around and see Australian universities go back up in the rankings, see student satisfaction get higher, and perhaps see some better financial management?
We are at a really important inflection point. It's going to be a hard road, whichever choices are made. I think that's the brutal reality of this. Some of those institutions that have already lost key staff and, that are already in the process of very painful restructuring, that's going to take a lot of time to work through the system. It will be a couple of years at least before consolidation happens in those institutions. And unfortunately, it's also taking a very long time for some of the key policy initiatives from the Albanese government to sort of dribble through the system. And some of those reforms are absolutely vital. One, which arose from the Australian Universities Accord, that was the Albanese government's sort of big sector-wide agenda-setting document. It's more than 12 months old now, and it was 47 really interesting recommendations. One of them was the creation of an Australian Tertiary Education Commission, a new sector-wide public body that would act as a buffer between governments and institutions and would help give the sector a kind of stewardship that it's lacked over at least 30 years now. We used to have a sort of body like this and it was for various reformist reasons removed. That new body has a very big job of work in front of it. It needs to find new ways to formulate funding models based on location and need and degree provision and cost of teaching per student. That's really important. It needs to help manage demand and fluctuations in demand across the sector so that you don't get, some universities spending millions to compete for a tiny number of students and others, hoarding new students. I mean, that's really important. And we need universities to be talking much more broadly about their civic role in the world around them. I mean, this is really important. And it's one of the things that I don't think is featuring prominently enough in the conversations we're having about universities at the national political level at the moment. It's really important that we remember these are institutions that serve a community, whether that's a state, a particular city, a region, the nation, or a part of the world. I mean, they're serving communities, and they really do need to put that back in the front of their minds.
Well, if I may end with an observation, whenever your work on this is made public, the impact is enormous. It's literally been front page news. So thank you both for the incredible work you do in this area, and thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks, Glenn.
And that's Follow the Money for this week. Don't forget, you can order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay, the first edition, After America, Australia and the New World Order, by Dr. Emma Shortis, which is out this week. You can purchase the first edition or become a Foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 20th of May, and some things might have changed since recording. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McVeigh from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.